Actually, I prefer Adelaide with new town size walls. And I think this is also important some of the distance. How's the hotel? Is it?
Because I've already been there for a short time. Is that even these mornings?
Yes, because we only have to
That's good.
That's all right. Oh my goodness. Well, as it turned out, I missed the 5 o'clock one. And I was just so Derek and I got together later on that afternoon. And if you're still interested in something, if you'd like to get together, schedule it when you're actually when you can fix your calendar. Fridays and Wednesdays. Yeah, so not the you know, look at your calendar, try to find it.
I know.
Do you have an interest?
Yeah.
Morning. There we go. Good morning. Welcome to our IA branch seminar, which has been promoted to a DST-wide seminar. And as John pointed out, it's the first promotion we've seen at DST Group for some time. This presentation is being streamed to all of DST. I'm just going to briefly introduce our branch, and then I'll hand over to Professor Bruns. So Intelligence Analytics branch applies the scientific discipline of analytics to enhance the intelligence analysis capabilities of defence, national security and law enforcement agencies. Analytics is a fast-growing scientific discipline related to the extraction, fusion and dissemination of meaningful content from data. It's a multidisciplinary field drawing on computer science, mathematics, linguistics, psychology and the social sciences, all of which are represented in our branch. IA branch and HSMA in particular have a long-standing research program in social media exploitation, including collaboration with the University of Melbourne, UniSA, Victoria University and DST Group's counterparts overseas. For example, we are developing capabilities for Twitter collection, processing and analysis to help understand how various actors make use of social media to exert social influence. It's now with great pleasure I introduce our speaker, Professor Axel Bruns. He's an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and Professor in the Digital Media Research Centre at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. He's the author and editor of several books, including Twitter and Society from last year, and blogs Wikipedia, Second Life and Beyond, From Production to Producage from 2008. He leads several major research projects that focus on the study of user participation in social media spaces such as Twitter and its implications for our understanding of the contemporary public sphere, drawing especially on innovative new methods for analysing big social data. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bruns.
All right, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and for particularly to Lucy and John also for making this possible and organising. Hello out to you out there in streaming land as well, if you're listening in. So I will talk about some of the research that we're doing at QUT, and I'm hoping this will be useful for you as well for the various projects that you're involved in. I thought I might start with just a little bit of background on our centre as well, just so you have a bit of an idea of where I'm coming from and what work we do more broadly. So the Digital Media Research Centre, DMRC, is a centre that really looks at the impact of the digital on our world from the social, the cultural, the economic domains to see how digital technologies change all of that, impact all of that, disrupt all of that. And we are particularly interested, of course, in digital research methods as well, to really develop the approaches and the tools to study digital media, digital activities, where possible also at scale and in close to real time. And of course, we're also very much a training facility. We have a fairly substantial number of PhD students. We train staff and colleagues as well in using these digital methods and including digital media research approaches in their own work. So we're a fairly broad-based centre that cuts across a number of domains, really everything from law and economics to media and cultural studies. And if you're interested, there's a bit more information there as well. And broadly, we have a number of key programs in the centre. One deals very much with public communication in the form of news and journalism, in the form of other forms of communication that ultimately are part of the public sphere and impact on democratic processes as well. We have one program that deals with the economic and industrial side of things, and that also includes policies, regulations, so really the nexus, I guess, of economics and law and industrial transformation around digital media. We have a project that is about the broader societal uses of digital media, digital technologies in everyday life, in everyday activity, and how digital media really impacts on all of this. And another, and really a kind of a transversal program that cuts across all of these, is about digital media research methods. So really developing the methods, and particularly also the methods that have generated a lot of the work that I'll be showing you today, that deal with big data, big social data from digital platforms, from social media platforms, and so on. That, of course, is very much an important area that is currently under enormous development, because there is so much data out there now that now can be processed, can be accessed, can be captured, and brought to use in meaningful ways. So that's broadly the focus of the center that I'm working in. And the work that I'm presenting here is really based on two major ARC-funded projects. One is my own Future Fellowship project, which is about 1 year into its 4-year lifetime. We are actually currently seeking another PhD student, so if you're interested, if any of you should be interested in doing a PhD, then by all means let me know. Although the application deadline is the 30th, so you've only got a few more days to apply. But what that project basically is looking at, and a lot of what I'm showing here is very much part of this project, is the question of how digital media and social media particularly are changing the way that information flows, that news is being disseminated across society, that we inform ourselves from a combination of sources, including mainstream media and including other social media particularly. So how all of this now fits together in a changing digital environment, digitalized environment, and really to understand what the future structure of the public sphere is from all of this, as we are incorporating more and more digital tools into this. And more broadly underlying this is, again, a great deal of technology as well that we're building through an ARC LEAF project. LEAF projects are basically infrastructure projects. So we've been partnering there with 3 other universities, and in fact with the National Library as well, to develop fairly large-scale comprehensive tools to gather data from social media platforms in Australia, to understand public communication on a very broad level via social media in Australia, and to make these data available to the researchers involved in the project. And a lot of the data that I'm presenting to you today will really be drawn from that infrastructure as well. So that's just as a quick preamble, so you've got a bit of an idea of where I'm coming from with all of this. Now, I will talk particularly about Twitter in this talk, not necessarily because it is the major social media platform in Australia. It obviously isn't. It's really the second most important social media platform after Facebook. But with Facebook, we have a problem of not being able to access large-scale data very effectively. And in fact, even if we could access technically, there would be huge ethical and privacy issues there as well. So not just our focus, but a lot of the focus in this field has been more on Twitter than on Facebook. That's to some extent a problem, we might say, but at the same time, Twitter is also perhaps a more important platform for particular types of public communication, especially when we're dealing with communication around topics of public interest, the news and crisis events particularly, that require a lot of people to come together who are not already in personal networks, as you might be with the people you're connecting with on Facebook. So Twitter is especially important in these sorts of events. Twitter itself, as I say, is the second most used social network in Australia. It's had particularly strong take-up since 2009 or so, and I'll show you some graphs that demonstrate that as well. It is, contrary to some public perceptions, and particularly some of the statements occasionally made by politicians who don't like what's being said on Twitter, it isn't simply some sort of young left-wing kind of community that's there. In fact, all the data that we have, all the surveys that have been done as well, and there was a recent census survey, again, the Telstra-owned company does annual surveys of social media in Australia, and they found, again, that it's actually almost a slightly older range, or sort of middle-aged range, I guess, of 25 to 55, from so professionals really at the height of their careers, if you like. are particularly represented on Twitter. So these skew almost naturally, particularly towards urban, fairly educated, fairly affluent users, possibly also slightly more likely to be male than female. That's been gradually broadening, and there's actually a new group that's arrived that I'll talk about a little bit later on, but it's still very much in that sort of demographic, and what I guess in advertising you'd call an AB demographic. They're usually the demographics that particularly TV advertisers are most interested in, because they tend to be the most influential demographic, the people who make household buying decisions, for example. So if you want to advertise a car, you advertise that demographic. That's the sorts of people that we're really dealing with here. And they tend to be people who are influential in their own right, but also who have a great deal of influence over others in their immediate networks, both through social media, but also through other social networks beyond the online. So they are a particularly influential, particularly important demographic. And that's why, again, Twitter research, while it certainly doesn't cover the entire Australian population in any kind of representative way, covers a particularly interesting slice of the population as well. And of course, if you've been following social media in Australia at all over the last few years, I probably don't need to tell you that we've seen Twitter play a particularly important role around breaking news events, crises, and this can be, of course, natural disasters. We've seen a very significant role for Twitter in natural disasters over the last few years. In political communication, also as a second screen medium that connects to television, for example, and connects to other events as well. That people are tweeting along with, that people are experiencing and sharing via Twitter. So these are just some of the kind of the key uses for Twitter in Australia. Now, we've been interested for some time now, for several years now, in really trying to understand not just how Twitter is used around these very identifiable sort of peak events, but really to get a sense of the broader structure and broader activities of the Australian Twitter sphere. So what we did at first with this, it's gone over a number of iterations. The first attempt that we made was simply to start from some known Australian accounts that were participating, for example, in relevant hashtags that were covering Australian events, like Spill, the initial Rudd Gillard leadership spill in 2010, as well as Auspol, which is a standing hashtag for political discussion. So we started with people who participated in those, and then simply crawled out across the follower network of these accounts to try and identify as many Australian users as we could. And that was reasonably successful, and by about early 2012, we'd found about 1 million Twitter accounts up to that point. And we started to then do some network analysis on that basis. But in a second iteration, we've tried a slightly different approach with this, where, and I'm trying to avoid the word simply because it's anything but simple, but we really simply went through the entire user ID number space of Twitter, from user 0 to what then was, I think, user ID 2 billion or so. And within that number space, we found a total of about 870 million active accounts. So not every Twitter ID actually has an account that's associated with it, because some have been created and then deleted again or been banned or whatever. But we found about 870 million active accounts. And we then filtered down this data set of all global Twitter accounts to accounts that we thought were identifiably Australian. And that included looking at their location and description fields, the fields that users themselves enter. Unfortunately, they're free-form fields, so it's not simply as simple as checking it just against a straightforward list of places or whatever. But we went with, I think, a list of the top 30 or top 50 from memory Australian cities, which, given that Australia is very concentrated in a small number of large cities, covers the vast majority of the Australian population. We went through and basically matched location description fields against these city names in various variations, and eliminated false positives like Perth in Scotland or Brisbane in California. So we tried where possible to remove those, and we also looked at time zone information that people had set for their profiles. And again, Australia has, of course, a number of unique time zones, none more unique than South Australia's, I would say. So we were able to identify also from that a good chunk of users who hadn't given any other information about themselves, but had at least set their time zone to an identifiable location. We checked a few other keywords and things as well, where people were saying, I'm in Australia or Oz or Australia or whatever. There's a few variations on the theme, but we were able to identify from that in total, in the end, about 2.8 million Australian accounts by September 2013. We're actually going to go through that process again later this year, and I would expect that by that point we'll find more than 3 million, maybe even up to 3.5, but that might be stretching it. So that's roughly our best guess for the Australian Twitter population. That's identifiable. We'll still have some false positives in this, of course, because some people will simply say, oh, I wish I was in Australia, and we may not always be able to identify those and weed them out from the collection. We will also no doubt have a certain grey area of people who we haven't found because they simply haven't given any identifiably Australian information in their profiles, where they haven't set the time zone, where they're just saying, oh, I'm just a regular dude. That we can't identify as Australian, obviously. So there are limitations to all of this, but we're quite confident that we have the vast bulk of the Australian Twitter population in our data set. And what we then did was simply to go through, again, I say simply, but it's anything but, we then went through and for each of those accounts captured their current list of followers and followees, so their connections in the network, to then finally establish from that the overall structure of the Australian network, the network between Australian accounts. So that's really the data set, I guess, that I'll be talking about for the most part today, combined with a few other data sets as we go. Yeah, what that gives us ultimately is a very good and fairly comprehensive basis of that gives us an understanding of the Australian Twitter sphere, its dynamics, its networks, its structures, and so on, and that provides then a significant basis for the research I'll be presenting here. Why are we interested in that? Why go through all our trouble of capturing all of this? Well, in the first place, Twitter research is still very much evolving and emerging in many ways. A lot of the work that's been done around Twitter has been using what we've been calling the low-hanging fruit in terms of data that's available about Twitter. So there's been, for example, a real abundance of hashtag studies. Hashtags, and for those of you who are not familiar, I don't want to assume anything, but essentially hashtags are a short keyword with the hash symbol prefixed to it that enable you to mark any tweet as belonging to a particular topic, and that enable other users then to track that topic by simply following the hashtag and seeing all those posts show up that have been marked with that hashtag. Now, if other users can do that, researchers, of course, can do that as well. So hashtags have been a particularly useful mechanism for capturing a lot of the tweets relating to particular topics. You could do that with a basic keyword as well, and some people have been doing that as well. But hashtags are particularly useful because it really means that a user has deliberately marked their tweet as belonging to a particular topic. Let's say Ozpol marks a tweet as belonging to general Australian political discussion. QLD floods means that the tweet is about the Queensland floods that we had in 2011, or subsequent flood events, of course. So it's easy for us as researchers to gather hashtag tweets. By extension, it's easy for us to gather tweets that have particular keywords in them as well. So there's been an awful lot of that sort of work that's been done over the last 5 years or so, I suppose, maybe more. And that's fine, and you can do some interesting things with that. You can look at the volume over time. You can look at the keywords actually appearing in those tweets beyond the hashtag itself. You can look at some of the networks of interaction, perhaps, between people who are mentioning each other, who are engaging with each other via the hashtag. That's all fine. But in a sense, that's really just the tip of the iceberg of communication that happens on Twitter, because only a certain percentage of all tweets are hashtagged. Even communication, even conversations that are perhaps related to the topic that a hashtag marks out don't always contain the hashtag. You might see a tweet that's got a hashtag in it, and then you respond to it, but maybe your response doesn't have the hashtag in it anymore because you're just responding to the person who posted initially. So what we're seeing when we're looking at hashtags, for example, is really just part of the overall conversation, a much broader conversation about the topic. We might even just be seeing sort of one side of a phone conversation where we've got all the hashtag tweets, but not all the responses to them that don't themselves have the hashtag in them. So we're really just, again, looking at a small tip of a much larger iceberg. And that's been a real limitation of a lot of the research that's been done around Twitter so far. There have been only a very handful of studies that look at perhaps parts of the overall user base that sample in a different way. So, I mean, we've done some work, for example, around elections where we've tried to identify all the Twitter accounts of politicians standing for election. And we've been looking at how they tweet and how people are responding to them as they tweet. So that's focused around particular populations that have been identified. There's been some studies that purport, and they're often coming from Twitter themselves, that purport to do much broader analysis of all the sort of tweets that relate to particular events and issues. And there we simply often don't know how they've been done, and we don't know how they've gathered. Often it just means that they've tracked a larger number of keywords, but ultimately they're still tracking keywords. There's been some work that's been doing follower maps, maybe starting from a single user and then looking out and seeing who follows them and how they're connected. But there's very little that does much more comprehensive work that looks at the entirety of the network map to understand how people are connecting up together, how perhaps the user base develops over time, so how many users are joining per day or per week or per month or whatever, or of course are deleting their accounts, are leaving Twitter again as well. How user careers themselves develop as well, from perhaps just joining and trying to feel your way around and connecting to a few people, to perhaps becoming a real leader and influencer in your network. So not much of that has been done because it's just methodologically a lot more difficult to do it. And we've been trying to change that to some extent with the work that we've been doing, but it is incredibly labor intensive and in fact resource intensive as well. So it's no surprise that not many people have really gone down that track so far. But we've been trying to really, I guess, however you want to see it, push the envelope or bang our heads against the wall to finally break through, but we've been trying to push against that and really get some more meaningful information about what happens on Twitter beyond just the hashtags themselves. And part of the problem with all of this is also that the way that access to Twitter data is shaped by Twitter Inc. itself privileges certain approaches, makes it very easy to gather hashtag data, makes it very hard to gather more comprehensive data sets unless you've got a lot of money to spend or you are prepared to bend or even break the rules of how you access the API. It's a lot easier also simply in terms of the research funding regimes to get funding for particular projects that look only at, say, crisis communication. We've had a project like that where we're able to gather just the hashtags relating to a crisis. It's much more difficult to convince a funder to get money for a much more long-term big data project that doesn't necessarily have a specific aim, that doesn't necessarily say we're only going to look at crises, but says we want to look at everything that happens in the Australian Twitter sphere. So a lot of the work that we've been seeing, other than the work that's been coming from Twitter Inc. itself and from some commercial research institutions, has been very exploratory. Has been very sort of limited to these specific cases, and that broader exploratory work has been much more limited. And also, frankly, organizationally, of course, the more you push into these harder areas, the more you also need to work interdisciplinarily. And again, that's been difficult, particularly in the academy, to really form those research teams that involve people from media and communication, people from computer science, people from hardcore statistics and database development and everything else. So it's a difficult field. It's very much an emerging and maturing field still. And we've been trying our best also to push it along a little bit with the work that we've been doing. So, but at the moment, most of the sort of the hard data work, the higher hanging fruit work, if you like, has been done by Twitter Inc. And commercial institutes rather than by scholars. And that also means that very often we have very little information about methods, approaches, and what is being presented ultimately as the outcome is presented in the form of press releases rather than fully detailed papers that we can then also analyze and perhaps critically review as well. So there's a real dearth of significant large-scale work on Twitter still in this field. Now, I've said already that hashtags are very useful because they are that sort of that macro space where people can easily get together and talk about events, particularly about breaking news events as well. They can very quickly come together when something happens. And, you know, the one example that lots of people always use is when the plane went down on the Hudson River, and immediately you had a hashtag that covered this, and people were posting up photos, bystanders were posting up photos. People were, I think, even tweeting from the plane saying, hey, we just went down on the Hudson, we're okay. So that sort of thing, a very ad hoc formation of a public saying, well, something's just happened, let the world know about it, and what do we have to do about it, and how do we deal with this? That's really what hashtags are particularly good at. That's the very much the macro level. It brings people together who do not have to be followers of each other. They don't need to be aware of each other. It's just by posting into the hashtag and by following the hashtag stream itself, you become part of that temporary community that's interested in that topic. But there are other layers of Twitter, and they have been far less well researched so far. So there's what we've been calling the meso level, the more everyday level, where you have people who you follow and you've got people who follow you, and that's sort of really the everyday streaming of information across the network, the everyday kind of dissemination of information, engagement with others and so on that happens through those networks. Not because tweets are hashtag, but simply because you follow someone, they post something, and if you're on Twitter at the time, you might see it, you might then respond to it, or you might pass it on to others, you might retweet it, and so on. So this is really based around what a colleague of mine calls personal publics. So each of us in our social media spaces have our own personal publics around us, the people who follow us, and we're part of other people's personal publics. And these are all obviously interconnected and overlapping to some extent. And that's a much slower process for that network to develop because you're not daily following new people, or other people aren't daily following you. So that's a relatively stable sort of structure of networks as well. And a lot of really the core of the interaction on Twitter really happens through those networks rather than because you're using hashtags or whatever. And the bulk of information flows through those networks rather than through hashtags. And below that, at the micro level, of course, you still have much more immediate and again more ephemeral kind of connections where people are engaging with each other, replying to each other, retweeting each other, and so on. And that's a space that is again just activated very quickly. You see something, you respond to it, and that might be the end of it. And that's sort of the micro level of very much interpersonal communication that often isn't even all that visible to others in the network. So it's very much just between people who know each other and who are connecting with each other through this. So again, that's a level that has been very much under-researched so far. We haven't seen much of that being fully explored yet, and there's a great deal of work that still needs to be done in that. And in a sense, below that level, you still have direct messages, but these are invisible, of course, to outsiders, so we don't even know what's going on there, and we certainly have no way of researching exactly what's happening there without being able to go behind the scenes and look at what Twitter Inc. itself knows about this. So that's outside the scope of what we're doing here. But really, ultimately, the top layer is pretty well understood by now from the research that's been done, but the other two layers, the meso and the micro level, they're the ones that we're still struggling to understand, that a lot more work needs to be done in. So we need to move into that space, and that's really what we've been trying to do. So how are hashtags also situated within that? To what extent do hashtags, in a sense, again, represent the tip of the iceberg of what else is going on? If we have a major hashtag flaring up, for example, can we automatically assume that there's an even broader network of meso-level communication about the same topic between people that simply doesn't use the hashtag itself? So is a hashtag usually a good indication that there is a lot of other discussion just within people's normal follower networks about the same topic as well? Or are these two totally disconnected from each other? What really happens beyond hashtags themselves? All of these sorts of questions still need to be addressed in much more detail. And really beyond hashtags and beyond these sort of breaking news events, what else are people using Twitter for? We know a little bit, I guess, from surveys and so on, but we know very little from actually from large-scale data gathering on Twitter about what people are doing day to day with their accounts. We simply haven't got enough information on that to make any meaningful judgments on that. So that's something that we're really trying to address as well. And Twitter users themselves, as well as Twitter Inc., are also quite active in changing and evolving the platform. Twitter users themselves invented the hashtag, invented the @reply. It wasn't Twitter, the company, doing this. And they keep coming up with new practices, with new ways of using Twitter. Twitter Inc. also keeps changing the way that the platform works. They change some of the facilities, the affordances of the platform, just the structure of what's being presented to you as you're using their apps or using their website. So all of this keeps changing how people are using Twitter as well. Changes in demographics, of course, also have an impact on how Twitter is being used. So Twitter is not simply a static, stable sort of space, but it keeps changing as well. And again, we're interested in how these changes happen and what drives these changes too. So that's another sort of more longer-term aspect that also needs to be understood further. So that's really where we're trying to go with all of this. Now, again, as I said, we've been pushing very much in a direction where we've been trying to get more data on all of this as well, where we've been trying to really go well beyond the hashtag itself as sort of the core object of analysis. And I want to show you now a few of the things that we found in doing that. So in the first place, this is actually, again, too, about September 2013. That's the growth of Twitter, the daily new accounts being created on Twitter. And this is from the 870 million user or accounts data set that we've gathered. So we're seeing from that there has been a relatively steady growth not just of Twitter itself, but also relatively steady growth in the number of new people signing up each day, with a number of notable spikes that to some extent we can explain, in other cases we can't. What we don't see in this, unfortunately, is how many people have deleted their accounts again, because as we were gathering this, we could only, of course, see the accounts that still existed at the time. So there may have been a much bigger spike, for example, in April 2009. More people might have joined than the 414,000 that joined that are still there. But if they joined and then deleted their account again before we gathered our data, they wouldn't show up here. So that's a limitation just of the process. But this gives you a bit of an idea of growth. We have a few cases where we know why people joined. So the April 2009 one, for example, is because Oprah joined, and everyone else who follows Oprah, of course, joined then as well. So what we're seeing from that, I mean, this is kind of amusing in a sense, but we also see the power of celebrity in promoting a new platform, a new way of communicating. And Oprah probably was one of the first major US celebrities who joined and who made this really a mass media space, a mass user space as well, beyond geeks and nerds who had perhaps joined before then. We're seeing a little bit there, for example, in March 2011, the tsunami in Japan that really created a spike as well in new signups. As again, and we've seen this a number of times. We've seen it in a smaller way also with the Queensland floods in 2011, with the Christchurch earthquake in 2011. So we've seen from time to time these sorts of spikes. They're driven simply by a major event, a major crisis, and by people pointing out that Twitter was a really good source of information, so more people are joining. We've got a few spikes that we're not really quite sure about. There's a big one there on the 11th of March 2012, and I still haven't found anything that really fully explains that. And in fact, it goes over, of course, a period of time. We don't know yet. If anyone's got any ideas of what might have been happening there, please let me know. And we see a very big spike there in June 2013, which we assume has something to do with the fact that Twitter changed its API setup, and there may have been quite a few people who were sort of in the last dying moments of the previous API were trying to register service accounts, bots and so on, that they could have no longer registered in the same way with the new API coming in. That's my assumption, but it's not entirely clear. There may have been also a lot of just internal testing at Twitter where they just generated a lot of new accounts to test, to stress test, I guess, their systems and make sure that they work with a lot of new users coming in. Not quite sure about that one, but it's an interesting coincidence that just happened exactly on the day that the new API came in. So that gives you a bit of an idea of sort of the global growth. By comparison, this is the monthly growth in Australia, obviously lower, no question about that. And we, again, did have a fairly significant spike in March 2009. I don't know that that's quite the Oprah effect here so much, but it's the effect of media reporting about the Oprah effect and about the overall sort of mass take-up of Twitter in the US that then also came here and had an impact on sign-up in Australia. And again, we've seen after that big spike of lots of people joining up, it certainly drops down again in terms of the monthly growth rate. But again, there's not quite a steady, but a reasonably good sort of process of people continuing to join, and even the numbers per month continuing to rise a little bit over time. So that's sort of been the story in Australia, at least to September 2013. So that's just to give you a bit of background on really when people joined and when Twitter really became important as a major social media platform in Australia. So again, as I say, what we've done from there then is to go through these 2.8 million accounts that we identified and to gather for them the follower networks that they had. And we've actually filtered that down for the graphs I'm going to show you in a minute. Only 2 accounts that had at least 1,000 connections in the network. So followers or followees put together, there had to be 1,000 or more. And that filtered the 2.8 million accounts down to about 140,000 really well-connected accounts in the Australian Twitter sphere, with about nearly 23 million connections between them. We've then gone through and essentially mapped that using the Force Atlas algorithm and Gephi, which is an open source network visualization tool. I won't say too much here about the settings that we used, but for any of you who've been using Gephi, that might be of interest. But basically what this produces then is a network map that's based on a gravity-based algorithm. So parts of the network where lots of users are connected with each other are clustering closely together. And those clusters are then at some distance from other parts of the network that they have relatively few mutual connections with. So people who are connected with each other pull each other together. People who aren't connected push each other away. Very standard sort of network visualization approach. And essentially then that gives us a certain structure for the network itself. What we then did was go through that network for the clusters that emerged from that. We looked at who are the leading users, the best connected users in each of the clusters. What are they about? What are they saying about themselves in their profiles? What are they tweeting about? To try and understand what their major topics were, and from that to identify what the major topics for each cluster were. And that worked very well. It's also worth saying, by the way, that the network, as I'm going to show it to you in a minute, looked very similar to the earlier iterations that we had already. So the structure of the Australian network has remained relatively stable in many ways. The topics that are represented have remained relatively stable as well. So there's a good deal of consistency also over time in what topics have brought Australian users to Twitter, and around what topics, I guess, they connect as followers and followees. Beyond that then, of course, in addition to just the network structure themselves, we do have some various statistics about the users themselves. We know when they joined Twitter. We know how often they've tweeted. There's a few other things that we can identify about them as well. So that is then something that we can superimpose on the network itself to also understand how perhaps particular parts of the network actually operate differently, or when they joined Twitter as well. So I'll go through that in a minute as well. But basically, then of course we have other data sets that we can also superimpose. So we know what hashtags people have participated in if we've tracked those hashtags. We know what links they've been sharing if we've been tracking those activities. So again, we can superimpose that on the map itself. So that gives us a good idea of what particular topics, what particular hashtags are active where in the network as well. And that, of course, then ultimately, if you put all that together, it gives us an idea of what the network structures are and how those structures are linked, correlated with tweeting activities. it gives us an idea of where users are in the network and what topics then they engage in. It gives us perhaps the opportunity to benchmark different topics and different activities against each other and so on. So that's then what that looked like. This is basically that map of the Australian Twitter sphere of about 140,000 accounts, the most connected accounts in the network, and you see there very obviously that there are clusters that have emerged in the network visualization. Now, you can visualize networks in many different ways, but these or similar clusters would emerge, I think, every time you do it. And I'll give you a bit of a moment to just have a look at that, but the important ones, I guess, to point out there is that we have a fairly significant cluster here around news and politics, and that sort of subdivides a little bit into left and right. It connects up more broadly into the news, and sorry, I should say so each dot on this map represents one account. The size of these dots is dependent on how many followers they've got. So that's why you see a number, and the color represents that as well. You see a number of fairly large green dots here. These are the ones that are particularly the major news accounts, ABC News, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, and so on, and some of the journalist accounts that also have a lot of followers, as well as some of the major politicians' accounts that also have a lot of followers. So you see there sort of the overall kind of news and politics kind of nexus, I suppose. We've got a fairly sizable cluster here that's around sports and which subdivides into different sporting codes. So we've got a fine subdivision there between AFL and NRL and rugby union and proper football and a few other things. We have some specific clusters that are a little bit to the side around cycling and V8s and UFC and horse racing. So that again makes sense because you're not necessarily a fan of all football codes equally, you're not a fan of all sports equally, so you will subdivide a little bit. But there's also a lot of cross-connection there. We've got a sort of a broad area here that's around sort of business, links a little bit into IT, links a bit into a number of particular types of business, real estate, for example, and so on. Yep. We've got, again, a cluster here that's around lifestyle, and in fact, Adelaide shows up sort of there separately a little bit. It's probably not quite Adelaide in South Australia so much as tourism SA and tourism Adelaide and the wineries and everything else, so they're particularly active on Twitter as well. And then we've got this massive cluster here on the other side that's around teens and teen idols and so on. And that's actually, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, but that's actually a cluster that has appeared relatively recently as well. So this is almost a secondary adoption of Twitter by teens who've joined much later than the rest of the network. Part of that is, I think, because the acts that they follow, One Direction, 5 Seconds of Summer, Cody Simpson, and so on, which I'm sure you're all incredibly familiar with. I think they've all encouraged their fans to join Twitter as a way of connecting with them and so on, and they did. Now, a few things there just as part of all of that. So there are very few accounts that are what Twitter calls protected, which is basically accounts where you can't see the tweets, and in order to see them, you have to be accepted as a follower by that account. They're the red spots on the map if you can spot any. But generally, Twitter is very much a public medium, and of the total, only about 3.5% are in fact protected accounts. So Twitter is very much a public medium, and that is true in Australia as well as internationally. There are quite a few verified accounts right across, so where people have actually written in and got Twitter to verify that they really are who they think, who they say they are. And that, of course, is celebrities, it's politicians, it's journalists, it's organizations, it's sports people, and so on. So that's why we find them particularly in that sort of top part of the map. The tweeting activity, so the darker the network is, the darker the graph is here, the more people have tweeted. And we're seeing, obviously, there's lots of tweeting in politics, quite a bit in sports, quite a bit in some of the business areas. This area here is sort of netizens, and they're sort of really people who are on social media to be on social media, people who are famous for being on social media, they're quite active. IT, tech, nerds, geeks, and so on, that's all very active. And in fact, some of the teens have been very, very active, although they've joined a lot later than the rest of the network. And what I wanted to go through then also just quickly is how the network itself has grown. So underlying there, you see in sort of gray there, just the overall shape of the network as it is now. And I'm going to step through year by year and highlight in yellow the new accounts that have joined. So 2006, practically nothing. A few netizens you might see there's a little bit of a few sprinkles of yellow. These are accounts that joined very, very early on. And it sort of grows from there. So the netizens, the social media, the tech people are quite active early on. It starts to go a little bit more into politics and the news and so on. And then it sort of grows more across the network. Still, politics is probably overrepresented there. In total, there's the sports cluster starting to grow, some businesses starting to grow. And by 2010 or so, we've had the first sort of spike of adoption that's actually happened. But you see the teens are still largely absent, and they won't really appear until 2011, 2012 really is when that fills out. So 11, 12, that's that secondary adoption of Twitter, when the rest of the Twitter sphere is pretty much all there already. You see that's all gone red to show that they've been there for a while, but the new users are still growing in that teen cluster. And then by 2013, well, that's when we stopped gathering, so that's sort of the end point of the network. Where we could, we've looked at location as well. That's more difficult because in some cases people will just say, I'm in Australia, and of course that doesn't help us so much. But time zones have helped, and a few others have helped as well. There's no real surprises there. For example, the AFL cluster is much more centered around Victoria. The rugby league cluster is more New South Wales and Queensland. Obviously, that cluster around South Australia is largely centered around South Australia. There's no surprise there. And politics, we see quite a few pink accounts showing up there. That's Canberra or ACT. Again, that makes sense as the federal capital and so on. What is surprising is that the teen cluster is particularly strong, in fact, around Queensland. And that is probably also true for some of the business cluster here. So I can't really quite explain that, but that's just what it is, really. And for some reason, we've got sort of in the center there a big bunch of WA people. And again, we haven't had a chance yet to look exactly at who they are and why they might be there. But we're seeing, again, some slightly different representation of the different states across the network map as well. All right, so just to demonstrate then, that is useful in its own right, but just to demonstrate what we then can do with all of this as well, I'm just going to superimpose a few hashtag data sets on top of that. So we looked at Q&A, the political talk show. We looked at Big Brother. We looked at the AFL Grand Final as well in 2014. And we gathered simply the tweets that were hashtagged with the relevant hashtags, as well as some of the that were mentioning some of the accounts or using some other terms that were more relevant as well, to see where on the map they would be represented. We've also been tracking for some time any tweets that link to particular news sites, and again we've got large data sets for that, so we can superimpose them on this. And so I just want to go through that to show you essentially what that tells us about the network as well. So the grand final obviously strongly represented in the sports cluster, but quite a few people who normally talk about politics are also interested. So there seems to be an interesting sort of crossover between politics and sports. Maybe they're both blood sports or something. I'm not quite sure what the relationship is. Even the teens get active a little bit, but this is because that year one of the guys from One Direction was tweeting about going to the grand final, so suddenly everyone was retweeting that and mentioned it. Not so much of an interest there in business and some of the other areas of the network. Q&A, well, no surprise, much more focused around politics, and nowhere else in the network really is there any strong take-up. The teens certainly aren't interested. Possibly, and this may have something to do with the guests that were on the shows at the time, more engagement there from the leftist side of the political spectrum than from the fairly hard right cluster there. But overall, fairly good take-up in politics, but not really much beyond. Big Brother, well, this was sort of at the tail end of the reign of Big Brother. By that point, Twitter had stopped caring, I think, and very few people who were very active on Twitter really engaged much with it at all at that stage. So then, again, I'll say a little bit more about, and I might just go another few minutes, Lucy, if that's all right. The one thing that we've been doing for some time is to track any tweets that link to the major Australian news and opinion sites. And we're tracking about 35 sites, which, given the structure of the Australian media landscape, pretty much captures all the major news organizations. There's really not that many of them in Australia. So we've been tracking any tweets that contain links, even if they've been shortened, that contain links to these sites since August 2012. And we've been looking at, essentially from that, the patterns of sharing, when particular sites are coming up, or when even particular stories on these sites are being shared widely, what the market share overall is on Twitter of these sites, or the mind share, if you like, and how that changes as well. We've been doing something similar also in Germany and with the Nordic countries, and that's overall what it looks like. So there's been an overall growth in sharing, and the other thing is that we've had a very stable sort of leaderboard where the ABC is far and away the most shared news site in Australia on Twitter, followed by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age and news.com.au, the Australian Herald, Sun, Daily Telegraph, and so on. So these are the most shared sites on Twitter. This is no relationship, by the way, to circulation figures or overall popularity, and that again tells us something about the demographics of Twitter, that they certainly don't represent the overall demographics. There's a strong skew here towards higher quality publications, whereas overall, in terms of accesses to these sites across the Australian population online, news.com.au leads by far, so much more middle of the road, almost tabloidy kind of site that leads there. That tells us something about the demographics, as I say, of Twitter itself, but also about the motivations for sharing. You may be more likely to share stories on Twitter that make you look good, that make you look like an intelligent person, rather than sharing all the latest celebrity gossip that you might be able to find on news.com.au. Apologies if anyone's a big news.com.au fan, but I think that's part of the driver here as well, that people won't just share everything that they read, but they'll share the things that, A, are interesting, but also kind of make them look like they're not just constantly following what Kim Kardashian's doing. So I think that's part of the pattern here as well that we're seeing. But what we can then do is, of course, again, look at the network and see who's sharing. So ABC News, and in a sense, this is market intelligence for these companies as well. So ABC News is particularly strong in the news and politics area. That's perhaps not surprising. It does reasonably well also in sort of the more kind of techie netizen kind of side. It does okay in sports. It's not very popular with the teens at all. And even in the sort of more business areas, there's not a great deal of take-up. That maybe should give Mark Scott a bit of concern that it doesn't quite hit those sorts of marks that perhaps it would aim to hit, or it would have ambitions to hit. News.com.au, as I say, well, still strong in news as well, as it draws on the resources overall of the News Corp network, of course. Stronger in sports, stronger also in celebrity culture, and really coming more into effect there with the teens as well, because it will cover One Direction, it will cover celebrities and so on. Again, not a huge deal of focus there in business, but perhaps a little bit more take-up also in sort of the lifestyle areas, because, again, that's also what it covers. And the Daily Telegraph, well, again, some news take-up still, a good deal more in sports, also a good deal more in celebrity, and again, not a space that you'd go to for business news necessarily. So again, what we see from that, and we could go into much more detail with this, obviously, is essentially the footprint of these organizations in the Australian Twitter sphere, the interest that people have, and the kind of I guess the market power that these organizations have there as well. And that also might be feedback where they might want to improve or where they might want to focus in their coverage, of course, because clearly that gets the punters in. Not just gets them reading, but gets them sharing as well, which is important these days. And I looked at the conversation as well as an opinion side, a scholarly opinion side, much more centrally focused again in sort of news and politics, and practically no take-up anywhere else. It's quite similar in a sense to the pattern you saw for Q&A, in fact. So there's probably some good overlap between those two, and could be space for cross-promotions even. All right. So just to finish off then, that's, again, very much been network-based sort of analysis that I've shown you there. But now that we have those 2.8 million accounts that we've identified, and again, we'll regather later this year, and hopefully we'll bring this up to date and have an even larger population that we'll have then. But essentially what we then decided is, well, now that we know them, we can start to try and follow them as well and see what they do, what they actually tweet about day in, day out. And that really gets us away from just being able to follow hashtags and keywords and other things that we have to identify as yes, they're out there and we can follow that. It gives us that background information of what do people actually do day by day outside of those particular spiky kind of events that might happen from time to time, but tell us nothing about everyday uses. So we've been building essentially the infrastructure to track on an ongoing basis what these people are doing, what these 2.8 million accounts are tweeting about day by day, to capture that, to store it, to make it also, ultimately it becomes an important database, important resource for longer-term historical research as well, because this is essentially a record of Australian public debate as well, with all the limitations that Twitter itself as a representation of what happens in Australia overall has, but at least that slice of the Australian population that is on Twitter, that tells us a lot about what they're interested in, what they're talking about, what excites them, what interests them, and so on. So that's something that we've been working on for some time now, and that tracker is now in fact operational, based on the user base again from 2013, so we're not yet tracking any new users that might have come along over the last 2 years, but that will change once we regather our user base. And I'm just going to finish off by showing you some of the first sort of impressions from that. So this is simply over the last few months, May, June, July, August. This is the tweets per day that we've seen from this. And it's now roughly at about 900,000 or so per day on average, although obviously there's weekly patterns where there's far less activity on weekends than on weekdays. That also tells us something about how Twitter is used, by the way, as a perhaps more professional space than Facebook might be, where the pattern might be different. There's also interestingly been something of a growth there. You see sort of the trend line that I've superimposed there through this, a bit of a growth in activity from May through to the end of August. That may have something to do with external factors. There was obviously a lot of political debate and crisis around during that time, so that may affect it. There may be other factors, maybe even the fact that we've been coming up to the final series and various football codes and so on. There could be a number of different things that influence this, but we're seeing a certain growth there. It'll be interesting to see if that continues or if that kind of comes down again as we come to the summer perhaps. But that's simply the observations that we've had so far. I've just done some very basic analysis. This is very preliminary, but just to give you an idea, this is the leading hashtags over this period, the most active hashtags over that period. And two really stand out. One is the green line there, that's Auspol, so the ongoing sort of standing discussion about political events in Australia, which really probably averages around 8,000 tweets a day. So that's a significant and obviously the leading hashtag in Australia in terms of total volume. But having said that, 8,000 tweets a day compared to 900,000 tweets in total a day also again shows us that there's a lot more to Twitter than hashtags. That we have really less than 1% of all tweets in a typical day in Australia are in fact hashtagged to what is the leading hashtag in Australia. So there's a really big breadth of activity that happens in Australia beyond that hashtag, and that's again why we need to move away from hashtag, from a purely hashtag focus. The other one that's also very active there and very spiky is Q&A, and that obviously happens every Monday as Q&A is being broadcast. That shows us something about just the importance of the Twitter tie-in for that particular show, and perhaps a reason that certain parts of the government don't like it so much, and certain parts of politics don't like it that much, because of the feedback that is happening there. But it obviously also again shows that you know there is a lot more here, because even that only spikes at about 16,000 tweets on its best day, and that's not a huge amount compared to everything else that was happening there. Now, of course, it might be that of the 900,000 tweets a day, there's still a lot of political discussion, for example, going on that's just not hashtagged. We simply don't know at this point until we can run some much more powerful analytics over the data that we now have. But clearly the hashtags themselves are part of Twitter, but they're not necessarily the most important part. They're simply the most visible part at this point. The other things that you see there as well, I mean, there's a few other hashtags. There's Follow Friday FF, that spikes every once in a while. There's Now Playing, which some music players will automatically tweet out as a new track starts. So there's some of the sort of more automatic things that get started. I think the number one, that's probably not meant to be a hashtag. It's simply where some people say something is number one. We have iPad anticipation, probably ahead of the Apple launch of the iPad Pro last week or week before. So, and down the bottom there, we've actually got Vote 5 SOS, which stands for 5 Seconds of Summer. That's the teens again. So that gives you an idea of what's represented, but really you'd have to look a lot more further down to see some of the other thematical hashtags that also are active. So hashtags, again, simply aren't everything that happens on Twitter. There's a lot more that happens on Twitter that isn't associated with any of these leading hashtags. And these are the most ad-mentioned users in Australia. For one, YouTube is at the top there and very stable across, because again, YouTube just automatically includes at YouTube as you're sharing a link to a YouTube video or as you're posting a new video. So that's almost an automatically generated ad reply or ad mention that is inserted whenever someone engages with YouTube and shares that via Twitter. So that needs to be treated slightly differently. The other 9, again, I'm sorry to say, are all members of boy bands. So that's the teens again. And again, there's a huge amount of that sort of interaction and ad mentioning of these teens and the bands themselves and so on. That is taking place over the course of a normal day. So that's, again, a very different use of Twitter than perhaps what we'd see in other circumstances. This may also be affected to some extent because, and I'm not across enough, but one member of one band just recently left, I think, during that time frame. So, of course, there was a big outcry. That may well have been, no, that's Justin Bieber, that may well have been this spike here around Liam Payne. I can't guarantee that that's true, but there's been some sort of personnel change, and that got a lot of people talking as well. So, but that again shows you a particular use of Twitter, and you'd have to go a lot further down to find perhaps some of the other largely ad-mentioned accounts. I mean, even with all the controversies that ultimately led to the change of Prime Minister, for example, Tony Abbott doesn't appear in this list, although lots of people were ad-mentioning him for various reasons over this time period. So that's interesting. The teens still have it over politics in this case. Again, this is really just a very basic snapshot just off the very top of that ranking. It would be very much more interesting to look further on down and see how particular political actors or other actors might be mentioned over the course, and particularly around events and themes and topics that they're involved in. I haven't had the time to really do this yet because this as a resource has only really recently become available. But that's really where our work is then also going to look more closely at really what's going on there under the surface. And that's it. So I hope that was useful. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have and discuss further. So any more information on all of this, please have a look at our websites, follow us, and so on.
Thank you, excellent. So if anybody wants to run out to a meeting, now would be a good time to go, and we can take some questions. Yeah.
So does concentrating on Australia hide some information? Like, how well are we connected to the rest of the world?
That's a really good question. Sorry, I should stand at the mic, I guess. The question was whether concentrating on Australia hides certain things, and it certainly does. I mean, one thing that we haven't looked at so far, but which we also have data on, is how Australian users, for example, are following international users and whom they are following. That also will be very interesting to have a look at, because it tells us something about, beyond Australia, where we get our information from or who we're interested in, I guess. And I would assume that there will be international celebrities, there will be international politicians like Barack Obama and maybe David Cameron and so on, that people are following. And that tells us something in a sense about our understanding of our place in the world, I guess, and where our important relationships are perhaps as well. So there's that. There's also, of course, perhaps what what other information we're bringing in to the Australian network and what we're sharing. So one thing that, again, we haven't done here so far is it'd be interesting to track some of the overseas news sources and see how they appear in our data as well. So are people sharing CNN and BBC and whatever else into Australia and enrich, in a sense, the information that is circulating here as well? How are they engaging with topics outside of Australia, whether that's the refugee crisis at the moment in Europe, or whether that's, I don't know, the papal visit to the US, or whatever it might be. So yes, absolutely, all of that is also very much of interest. I mean, for our purposes, simply from a very practical point of view, we decided to limit it to the Australian user base to start with. But within that, obviously, we can then also look at least within that user base, what are they doing? What are they doing that's not connected purely to Australian issues and topics and so on? And that will certainly be among the research that's going to emerge, particularly from this resource that we now have. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just wondering, when you filtered the users in terms of they had to have 11,000 connections, what's the distribution in that user base in terms of ratio of followers to followees for individual users? Because obviously the celebrity will have a lot of followers, not many followees, and someone like myself has 0 followers and lots of followers. So what was the distribution?
Do you want to share your account so other people can follow you? No. Look, I mean, yes, I can't offhand remember the details, but of course there is very much a typical sort of power law distribution there, that there's a handful of users who are very widely followed. I think back in 2013, when we did it, the most followed Australian user was it was Hugh Jackman at that point, followed somewhere close by Kevin Rudd. Although, the difference there is that Kevin Rudd is largely being followed by other Australians. Hugh Jackman would have had a lot of followers from overseas as well. So, again, depending on how you even look at that, whether you only look at the follow numbers within the network, then certainly you have a parallel distribution. You'll see some politicians, some celebrities, some journalists who are very much, and some sports stars probably, who are very much at the top of that list, and then it drops off fairly quickly, and you've got sort of a middle layer of users who maybe have in the 5 to 10,000s or so, who are kind of still amongst the more influential groups, and then it really peters off. If you looked at people who if you look at the total follower numbers on Twitter beyond the Australian Twitter sphere, then of course you'd find that those Australian users who are most followed are the ones who are internationally represented, like the major actors. So Hugh Jackman, Nicole Kidman, blah, blah, blah. Maybe some of the international sports stars, although, that may also already be limiting, because there's a problem there with some sports being very Australia-centric and not having a huge international following necessarily, like AFL, for example. So, but yeah, that's the sort of pattern that you'd find, that the most visible, internationally visible Australian accounts would be the ones that are, of course, that have an international following as well. But overall, there's a typical sort of power law distribution that we see almost all the time in this sort of stuff.
Yeah. Do you have any analysis of why people delete their Twitter accounts? For example, celebrities might delete their accounts after putting their foot in their mouth, for example.
Nicely done. Yeah. It's difficult to say, because largely what we see are just the accounts that haven't been deleted here. It's the accounts that haven't been deleted. Because as we're gathering, of course, at the point that we're gathering, we'll only be able to gather the accounts that still exist. If they've been deleted, they simply don't show up, and the user ID that Twitter is using will simply be empty and have no details attached. As we're now regathering this year, we will be able to compare and see which of the accounts from our 2013 data set have disappeared in the 2015 data set. That will be very interesting.
If user X appears yesterday but not today, then you can only guess that they deleted their account after a period of silence.
That's right. They disappeared for some reason, but we don't know quite why. And I guess, from what we know, there's a number of different reasons. One is simply that people were trying out Twitter and it didn't work for them, and they go away again. It might be that they put their foot in their mouth. It might also be that for some reason, some circumstances changed and they started a new account. We've seen this with changes of political leadership, for example, where And I think in the Queensland election, for example, after the 2012 change of government, the previous Labour government deleted the Queensland Premier account, and the new coalition government started a new one under the same name. So that was, and that was organised between them basically, because I guess Labour didn't want to give all the followers that the existing account had to the new LNP government, but at the same time they also understood that yes, passing on the account name in a sense would be okay. So you've got one account, same username disappearing, and a new account under the same username being set up. But of course they would have different IDs then internally, because the previous one has been deleted and the new one's a new setup. So we see these sorts of changes from time to time as well, and various others. So I mean, more broadly, it might also be interesting to see how much people are changing their usernames. So your ID will stay the same, but your screen name could change. You could rename yourself today and name yourself something entirely different. Again, we see that with some politicians. Kevin Rudd, I think, was K-Rudd PM, then I think he became K-Rudd MP. Now he's Mr. K. Rudd. So, you know, you see as circumstances change, obviously. Yeah, I mean, exactly, that sort of stuff. So you kind of get that changeover, obviously, as they change rules or whatever as well. I mean, we could go through all of them who've lost their seats recently or whatever, and many of them will have at least dropped the MP from their account. So, hopefully. So, yeah, that sort of change we see as well. But, of course, in many cases, we have to really talk to them, interview them to find out why is it that you changed, because it might not be obvious from the data themselves.
Did you do any filtering with language? Did you sort of clear out and just use the ones that were auto-identified as English by the Twitter?
We had a look at that, although there are also quite a few accounts that are tweeting in other languages. I mean, I sometimes tweet in German as well. Because of course Australia is very much a multicultural country as well, and there are quite a few people who are clearly based in Australia and are tweeting in English about Australian things, but then engage with their friends and family overseas in some other way.
Students as well.
Of course, yeah.
They'll be very active, but all their followers are their friends back in their home country.
Absolutely. So we didn't look so much at language because it just didn't seem particularly useful. What is interesting though is, and I haven't done this here yet, but it'll be interesting to see of the ones that we've identified as Australian, what languages they typically tweet in, and how that maybe spreads across the map, or how that might show us different communities of users who might certainly be Australian but connect around a shared language or shared ethnicity or so as well. Yeah.
I was just going to actually ask that, because other than the meteoric rise of tweens obsessing about neon leaving one impression or whatever, you said that the majority of the Twitter sphere was almost middle class-ish, I guess, in terms of affluence and education. Yep. Also, it's reflecting their interests and their tastes and their habits and all that kind of stuff. I was wondering the extent to which ethnic diversity is also captured within this, and whether the people themselves are self-identified as being Australian or not. I mean, because they're located in Australia and they're interested in football, it doesn't necessarily make them Australian or view themselves as being Australian. Yeah. So how representative is that of Australian identity and Australian tastes and interests?
It's a good question, and I guess, I mean, I've talked about Australian accounts, but really it very much depends on what you call Australian or whatever. These are the accounts that we've identified, in a sense, are probably Australian based. It might be a better term, because yes, there may also be international visitors, students, permanent residents or whatever who live in Australia but are not Australian citizens. On the other hand, there may also be a handful of people in there who are Australian, who say they're Australian but say, I'm an Australian living in London or Australian living somewhere else, or have international lifestyles that take them all over the world, but who are still saying hometown Sydney, currently working in New York, whatever. So in that case, we would still have them in there because they mention the places that we've been tracking for. So this is always the problem with trying to identify a population from what they say about themselves in free-form text fields, of course. There is that sort of fuzziness around the edges. There isn't a great deal of additional work, I think, that we can do to really try and distinguish more clearly between that. So what we have basically represents people who self-identify as Australian or Australian-based put together. Yeah.
Did you find it difficult to settle upon a particular metric for boiling down what is undoubtedly high-dimensional data into a two-dimensional connections map, or was that something taken care of by the software?
In a sense, it's taken care of by the Twitter API because a lot of, I mean, the map itself is ultimately based on what the API tells us about who's connected to whom, and that's a sort of Twitter-defined really metric, I suppose. I mean, beyond that, of course, yes, you can bring in a lot of additional dimensions on top of this as well. One thing that will be very interesting now that we've got much larger data on day-to-day activities as well is to actually look at both this map of who follows whom, but then also a map of who @mentions whom, who retweets whom, and so on, and to see how those are, or whether those are correlated in any form. You know, it might be that, yes, you follow all the people who are talking about politics all the time, but you end up retweeting all the people who talk about sports, or in whatever other permutation you want. So one of the next steps is also to layer these types of networks on top of each other. In a sense, you could kind of treat a hashtag almost as a network as well, because people who tweet into a hashtag kind of form part of that community as well. And so the superimposing of the hashtag on top of the map again adds another dimension to that as well. We are still experimenting with that, I think it's fair to say. There's a number of different directions that this will go in, and we're over the next really few years or so, we have any number of combinations of data points that we'll explore there to see what actually are the sorts of the meaningful patterns that emerge from that, basically. Yeah.
You mentioned an interest in trying to extract the content or exploit the content of tweets. Is there much left to exploit once you get rid of the hashtags, the tiny URLs, @mentions and so on? And if there is, what prospect do you think there is of natural language processing techniques being able to exploit what's left?
Well, I mean, your second question is the answer to the first one, I think, that yes, absolutely, once you take out, or once you've dealt with, you're not necessarily taking them out, but once you've accounted already for hashtags and @mentions and so on, there's still simply the free-form text that's in there, of course, and that's, in many cases, the bulk of the tweets, of course. So there is a need to find better ways to process all of that. It's difficult because they're so short, and a lot of NLP techniques, I guess, are better suited for longer texts because they can then understand the structure of the text and extract the keywords and patterns and so on more effectively. But yes, there's a lot of work that can be done with that. It might be necessary not just to look at individual tweets, but perhaps at a series of tweets from the same user. There may be other approaches that you can take that take into account some other contextual data of, for example, again, where in the network the user sits, or who they're connected with, or what they say about themselves in their description and so on. But that's, again, one of those really big steps that we haven't addressed yet, to really use those sorts of techniques to really understand how we might process at large scale these very large data sets of tweets that we're gathering. Because that then also ultimately could tell us much more than hashtags themselves can, for example, about the day-to-day patterns of the themes and topics that are being discussed in the Australian Twitter sphere, and really what is currently a hot topic, if you like, and that may be everything from the guy leaving One Direction to, the change of Prime Minister to, the football finals or whatever else. So that, I think, will be very, very interesting to do, and we're not quite there yet, but that's on the list. So I think that's certainly, that's one of the things. One thing that we've started to do already, and we had a trial around the G20 last year, was to look at tweets that contain any mention of place marks, locations, and so on. So what we did there, we just worked with the hashtag dataset around the G20, but within that we tried to identify mentions of Brisbane locations to see what locations people were tweeting about, because they were upset about road closures or barriers or whatever else, or because they'd seen Obama's motorcade come by, or because Angela Merkel was there and just chatted on the street with people, or whatever it might be. so trying to work out where the hotspots, I guess, in terms of local activity around this, what are the locations being mentioned, that's something that worked reasonably well, but the problem there is that you have to put a huge amount of energy into developing a gazette of place names first. Because again, you're dealing with free-form user-generated text that may not always use the correct names, might misspell names, might shorten them, might use colloquial names for them rather than the official term. So we had to deal with a lot of that beforehand before we could really identify place names effectively. That can work if you know that there's an event coming and you know it's in a particular location, in a particular area where perhaps you can capture the place names, but for anything more broadly across Australia, for example, that'll be a lot more difficult to do that. And it can't be quite done in the same way. So, but that's one example of, well, identification of named entities, I suppose, in that case. That can actually generate some interesting outcomes by running that over a large corpus of tweets as well. Yeah. I think that you...
Yeah, to what extent is your analysis automated? Is it fully automated or is it sort of still a bit manual?
There's a lot of manual work still in there. We have the tools to identify particular types of content, I guess, reasonably well. I mean, we can easily pull out. Let me backtrack. We have certainly the automated tools to gather the Australian user base, and that needs to be automated because of the size of that. We have the tools to gather the networks of that user base and to gather the tweets produced by that user base. So the gathering tools are largely automated. Where it gets more difficult then is to do any meaningful analysis with that. So, for example, understanding the structure of the network and working out what the clusters are about is manual, because you end up going in there, you're zooming in, you're working out who are the leading accounts there, and then you look at their profiles and try to work out what they're about, basically. So that... And there's some, again, natural language processing, for example, that you could perhaps do on the descriptions of these accounts to pull out the themes in a more automated way. But there's still a lot of manual oversight that needs to happen there. I think more qualitative approaches there. Analyzing the tweets and the tweet data set itself. Well, again, you can easily manually pull out the hashtags and the ad mentions and so on, but. But the analysis of that then, or even choosing which of these then to look at, that's of course still very much a manual process. And if you just looked at the top ones, well, again, you'd see what I've shown you there, that a lot of the top ad mentions are for teen stars or YouTube. A lot of the hashtags are for fairly generic things like Follow Friday and OSPOL. That's interesting in its own right in some way, but it's probably not very useful if you're looking at particular themes and topics, and there you then have to really do a lot more manual work. You might have to create buckets of terms that you're interested in, for example, that link to particular things. We want to track, say, the discussion about climate change. Well, there's a number of terms that we could identify that relate to that, and we could then find them in the overall data set. But and we could maybe add some users that we know tweet about this fairly consistently, we can add them to the data set. But again, that's manual work, and that needs to be manual work, I think. So not everything can be automated in that sense.
It's probably a good time to stop. Please join me again in thanking Alex. Excellent. Thank you. Got another visitor tomorrow called Alex. Actually, we'll be hanging around for the rest of the day, so there is opportunity to talk more with him if you like, but if you'd like to ask any questions.
Absolutely.
Yes. You always get to call you Alex. It's all right. Always happens.
There's actually a guy I know who's called Alex, so we always get confused with each other.